So now let's talk about logging. Logging is the ability to take information about the system and dump it someplace that we can review it. That could be flat files, that could be a database, that could be some sort of blob storage, could be just to the console, as I'm going to show you. It's a built-in way to handle logging in a general way so that in different environments you can decide to turn logging up or down as you're trying to get different pieces of information about the system. First thing we'll want to do is enable logging in the configure services, and we do this by calling add logging. Now, add logging is included in the ASP.NET 5 assemblies, and so we can tell it to go ahead and enable logging, to opt into logging, as far as being able to use it from other parts of our system. Once we've added it to the service container, we can go ahead and also add it to the configure so that we can actually configure logging. We do this by supplying a logger factory. In order to configure this, we're going to call logger factory and then add a type of logging that we want. So out of the box, there's two logging factories that we can get at. One is to log to the console and one is to log to the debug window. We're going to use debug window for our examples, but it uses a provider model so that you can then log to different sources. You could be logging, again, like to a database, a blob file, flat files, whatever it be. It's just a matter of being able to add your own logging provider. For us, we'll just call add debug. And debug is in its own package, Microsoft Framework Logging Debugging. And when we add this, we're going to tell it the log level that we want to get in the debug window. And I'll start with information, which is a fairly low level one. What you're going to find is that in debugging, you're probably going to want something like information or maybe even debug level. Both of those will give you quite a lot of information. But in production, you're probably going to want to raise this to something like critical, error, or at worst, warning. But let's start with information so we can kind of see what happens here. By enable logging, other subsystems inside of ASP.NET may already be using these, even before we use them. So let's run this with the log information turned on. Let's get rid of that breakpoint and let it run. So we have our website working the way we expect it to, but let's see what happened in the debug window. The debug window now contains a bunch of different information, and a lot of this from the Entity Framework. The Entity Framework here, the Microsoft Data Entity Storage Database, is going to include information that it is logging to the log file as well. And this is because we've picked information. This is informative messaging, and you can tell that because right after the name of the source of the log is going to be the level of the log. And the idea with logging is that as you change the level, they're ordered. So everything from the level we're asking for and above will be included in the log, but everything below it won't. And information's about in the middle. So debug messages wouldn't be displayed in this case, but information would, as well as critical and error information, which are above informational level. And so here we can actually see some information about the context of our query. And if we look down here, we'll actually see this expression that was generated to be executed on the database. This expression was actually being done by the seeder, right? It just wanted to say, hey, are there any objects from the database? Let's go down a little. We should be able to see the same thing for the select expression for our getting of data from the trip database. There it is, select ID, created, name, and username from trip. So we can start to see actual informative information about different subsystems. But of course, for a very simple system, there's a lot of code going on here, right? There's a lot of information here. So we might want to change this and change our startup to give us, let's say, warning information and above. Let's run it again. We'll see that no logging information currently is causing warnings or above, unless we had some exceptional case like the database couldn't be opened or whatever, and then that would still be logged out here into the debug window, or wherever we have configured logging to happen. Let's see how we would use logging in our own applications, and let's do this in the repository. This is a pretty common place where you'd want to use logging, and so here we're going to include to be injected into our repository AI logger interface. The iLogger interface takes a generic parameter, and that is the class that is doing the logging. So that's going to be world repository in our case. And we just need to add the using statement, Microsoft Framework Logging, and we'll call that the logger. And like before, we'll go ahead and use refactoring to generate our field. And now we have a logger object. So what are we going to do with it? These might not work the way we expect them to. They might be throwing exceptions. So best case to do is to use try to catch the exception so that we can, you guessed it, log errors. So we can use the logger, and here we can say log with what level the error is, or log the level of information we want to be sending out. But for us, it's going to be an error if we don't like it. And there's a number of overrides here. I'll just use the override here that says could not get trips from database. And then I'm going to allow myself to pass in that exception. So the details of the exception will be logged as well. And let's do the same thing. I'll use some editor inheritance to add it to our project with stops from the database. And so now we're being good citizens about having a good way to handle these errors. But of course we have to figure out what we want to do with them, right? Here, if we do have an error, I'm just going to return null. So we have some indication that it failed, so that we're not returning anything valid. Now it could be that we decide to return empty collections, or even throw the exception when we're done, once we've done logging it. It really depends on your use case. I'm going to return null for now, but you can decide which makes the most sense. Do you want to propagate the exception up, where you might get multiple logging? Do you want to be able to display the error to the user? What do you want to do? So if we run the application now, we'll be able to see that we didn't have an exceptional case because none of those logs came through as an error condition. Now that we have logs, we're going to be using the logging to write out information as we complete our project for any exceptional cases like we saw here in the repository. We're going to want to make sure that we're logging any problems so that later on we'll have a way, especially when we get to production, to look and see what problems are happening and to be able to capture the error information when it happens on live web applications, not just assume the user is going to report, oh, I wasn't able to create a new trip, delete a trip, whatever the functionality that trouble they ran into. Let's wrap up this module.